Do you sometimes find yourself really feeling stuck? Like you've taken pictures of everything there is to take pictures of in your area. You just can't think of anything new to photograph. You really just kind of get in a rut. Well, we all get that way sometimes. Let's talk about that. Hey, thanks for joining me today. Photographers by nature are generally a pretty creative group of people, and yet still, sometimes we all find ourselves in this place where we just can't think of anything new to photograph. Seems like we've photographed everything interesting there is in our area, and we get in this creative rut where we just don't know what to do. And so today I'd like to talk about my top 5 ways that I use to jumpstart my creativity and to be able to go out and find some new and interesting things to photograph. And I'm also going to, if you'll stick around to the end of the video, kind of run through a list of some extra ones. I won't go into as much detail on them, but we've got some kind of extra ideas also that you might be able to use. If you would, please click on the like and subscribe buttons, and let's get started. The number one way that I use to recharge my creativity, one of my most favorite ways, is to go out and shoot pictures of reflections. Now for me, this started with a day where, kind of like what I'm talking about, I wanted to go out. I had some time on a Saturday morning to go out and take some pictures, and I just couldn't think of anything that seemed interesting. And so I decided, instead of taking pictures of something, I would take pictures instead of reflections. So I went downtown. We have a lot of buildings that are modern. They've got a lot of glass on them and a lot of reflective surfaces. And I just concentrated on taking pictures of reflections, images reflected in windows and in the glass and reflective metal surfaces of these buildings. And it gave me a really fresh way to look at that area and a way to look at the subject in a completely different way. So it helps us to find a new way to look at the world around us. And so reflections are a great way to kind of recharge your creativity, and you can find some really interesting images. Everything from, like I said, glass, windows, reflective surfaces like that, metal, it's polished, even water puddles. Here in Oklahoma, we have so much wind that smooth, reflective water puddles are kind of a rare thing. But depending on where you're at, there's lots of opportunities to use reflections to create some really beautiful images. So reflections, give that a try. My second way of kind of jump-starting my creativity is to take pictures of texture. And I really love texture. I like doing macro photography and close-up photography, and so that texture really kind of comes into that. But when you go out and you shoot a picture of, let's say, a building, you've got a picture of a building, but if you get closer and you find texture in the wood or the rock or stone that the building's made of, rusty metal objects, there's all kinds of things that have just really beautiful and incredible texture. Even a lot of plants and trees and other things when you get in close, have some really beautiful texture. And so that's a great way to find a new subject, find a new thing to photograph, and instead of photographing objects as they are, to get closer and to look at the texture on the surface. It's like a picture of a door, might be interesting if it's old and kind of faded, but when you get really close and you can see the cracks in the paint and the peeling paint and the colors of the different layers, now all of a sudden, that texture really is the key point of the image instead of just a part of it. And so getting close and finding pictures where you can get in close and see the texture is a great way to give you something new and interesting to photograph. My third way of kind of recharging my creativity is to go out and find pictures of shapes. And this was kind of something I happened upon kind of by accident. I was actually photographing an old pickup that's part of a display, I guess you might say, or of a garden area at a flea market. And as I went around the truck and took pictures, I noticed that on the wing window, the glass was delaminating. So, the glass in car windows is laminated. It's 2 layers. And as those 2 layers started unlaminating or delaminating, it created some really interesting shapes. And so I grabbed a macro lens and got in close and started photographing these shapes, and made for some really interesting images. And since then, I've really found that shapes are a really interesting way to recharge my creativity. You know, instead of looking for, everything has a shape. Everything we photograph has a shape. But often there are shapes within those objects that are unique and interesting. And when you start looking not as a picture of something as a whole, but as parts of it and the shapes that those parts contain, you can find some really interesting subjects. So look for those shapes. Oh, and did you see the ghost in those shapes? Shapes, give those a try. Now, my fourth way of recharging my creativity, and actually I probably should have made this one first. It's one of my favorites. It's perspective. You know, when we go out and take pictures, we, typically stand up. We've got a camera in front of us. We take a picture from eye level, and we see the world as we, walk around, drive around, whatever. We kind of see the world at eye level. That's the perspective that we are used to seeing everything at. And the vast majority of pictures are taken from eye level. But if you want to create something that's really unique and different, change the perspective. Change the way that you're looking at your subject. And that can very easily mean getting the camera much lower or much higher when you do that. Or just the angle of view, which we'll talk about that too. But one of the things I love about modern cameras today, digital cameras, is that you can flip the screen up. Some of them, like the camera I'm filming with, it swings out to the side and you can turn it. But this means I can get this camera down on the ground and get a kind of a bug's eye view of the world. And when you do that, you find that the world looks a lot different from just that difference in height, that small difference in height. So perspective is a great way to kind of recharge your creativity. Take your camera out and just say, every picture I take this morning, I'm going to shoot it from ground level. I'm going to get that camera down on the ground and see what the world looks like that from that perspective. Or, maybe if you're downtown or you're amongst buildings, find some areas where you can get up high in a parking garage, or, if you have access to some buildings, get up at a higher level and shoot down at the world. Another thing you can do is change your angle of view. One of the times I was talking about being downtown, I decided to basically shoot pictures mostly looking straight up. And I used a really wide angle lens on a micro 4/3 camera. This was an 8mm lens, and basically was just aiming the camera mostly straight up. Found some really unique images I could create by looking at downtown from just that different angle of view. So perspective is a great way to change the way your images see the world, so to speak. There's, when you think about it, lots of animals and bugs and, your dog or cat see the world quite differently than you do. And so being able to take pictures from those different perspectives gives your image a unique look at the world. And so give that a try. It's one of my favorites, perspective. Change your perspective. My fifth way of kind of recharging or jump-starting my creativity is to look for unique light and shadows. So, everything we photograph obviously has light and it has shadows. That's a normal part of it. But when you can find really unique lighting or shadows, or where light meets shadow, you can really find some creative images. So I talked earlier about going downtown and shooting pictures of reflections, and that was a bright sunny morning. And one of the things I noticed was that sun, was fairly low in the sky. It was reflecting off some of these, very reflective buildings. And while the windows on these buildings are, pretty much in the same plane, they're not all exactly at the same angle. So the light they were reflecting, down onto the street and onto subjects was really unique. It was kind of splotchy and mottled and just made for a really unique lighting and in pretty intense lighting too. So I was able to take a few pictures that really showed off that lighting and made for some unique images. The other thing are shadows. I really like it, again, when the sun's low, either in the morning or evening, and you can, make shadows of your subject as much as part of the image as the subject themselves. Light and shadows, definitely unique lighting and unique shadows are absolutely a great way to kind of recharge your creativity. So those were my top 5 ways. But as I spoke about, I've got a kind of a running list here of some others I want to run through real quick. Not going to spend quite as much time on them, but there's some great ideas. The first one I want to talk about is silhouette. If you haven't ever tried to shoot silhouettes, it's not real hard. Basically, you're exposing for a bright background that turns, the subject of your image black, more or less. And so silhouettes are really interesting. So shooting pictures where you intentionally go out to try to shoot some silhouettes, or if you have an idea for a silhouette, those are great. The other one is lines, and here we're talking about the perspective of the lines, the angle of the lines, where they might be leading lines, or just the shape of something, the line that it has becomes really unique. And so you're looking for something that has some interesting lines to it. And I know that's leading lines is a compositional thing that's not uncommon. That's pretty readily used, and yet still sometimes you can go out and look for things that have form or lines that are unique. The next one are colors, contrasting colors, and I do this a lot with macro photography, where I'm looking for something in the image that has a unique contrasting color. So, it might be a red leaf amongst a bunch of greenery, or it might be, just something that has a unique color that really stands out amongst everything else in the image. So colors, contrasting colors are another great way. The next two are kind of following the subject of projects, maybe, but I still like to do them from time to time. The first one is places of personal interest. Now, pictures of places that are interesting to you, or maybe have some sentimental value to you, may not necessarily be that interesting to other people, and yet somewhere down the road your family is probably going to appreciate having a collection of some of these pictures, especially if you document what those places are and why you took pictures of them. The picture I'm going to show on this one just real quick is an old warehouse that my grandfather used to work in. It was a Sinclair Oil pipe yard and warehouse. We worked in the oil field back in the 30s, and he managed that warehouse. And it's just an old rundown building, nothing really extraordinary about it. I'm sure going to tear it down before too long, so I wanted to capture a nice image of it to have, because every time I drive by that building, which is pretty frequently, I think about my grandfather, and at some point they're going to tear it down and it won't be there. And so I wanted to have a nice image of it to remember. So places of personal interest can be a great way to find unique things to photograph. The other one is topics of interest. Recently, we, of course, having all kinds of oil price issues these days. Oil prices are really high, gas prices are really high, and being in Oklahoma, we have tons of oil wells. Even in the town, in the city, our state capitol grounds has oil wells on the capitol grounds. So one morning, I went out and just photographed oil wells, tried to find a bunch of different oil wells. And in the end, I didn't really find much use for those photographs other than, it kind of opened my eyes to really how many of those things there are around our town. I even found one that was, I looked it up, there was a name plate on the fence, and that well was drilled in 1943, and it's still operating. So, it kind of gave me some history and perspective on the oil industry, and it was just a fun project to shoot. So that's, projects are kind of cool. They're another way to do this, but those two are probably my favorite: places of personal interest and topics of interest. The other one is new methods. All of us have some favorite thing we do with photography, whether it's portraiture or landscape or macro or, whatever it is that's your favorite thing to photograph. Think about trying something new. If you're a landscape photographer, try doing some macro, or maybe, find a subject and go shoot some portraits. Just really get out of your norm in terms of what you photograph. So new methods, it might be cityscapes. You might go out and shoot architecture, street photography. There's just an unending list of different things to photograph, wildlife and flowers and, you know, all kinds of things. So if your norm is to go out and shoot one type of subject, change it. You know, spend a day shooting something completely different. You'll have a lot to learn in order to do that, and it'll probably you'll find some additional things that you like to do with your photography that will kind of get you out of that rut. The last thing is gear, and I kind of hesitate to go down this road too much, in that it's really easy to kind of get caught up in this idea that if I buy one more lens or one more camera or whatever, then I'll have this way to photograph things that I can't photograph now, and so I need this additional gear, and that can be a real trap. So with some hesitancy, I talk about gear. So, you know, if you shoot digital and, you know, you have a variety of lenses or whatever, maybe get a film camera. Get out and try shooting film again if you've never done that, or, you know, again, or for the first time if you've never done it. So a film camera. Or if you want to stick with digital, maybe try shooting some vintage lenses. You know, a lot of these vintage lenses can be had very inexpensively, and the adapters are very cheap. I've got a video about that. I'll put a link down below. So, you know, try shooting some vintage lenses. Another thing you could do would be some really different focal lengths that you don't have. If you don't have a really wide angle lens, this is the wide angle lens I talked about earlier, you know, get a lens that, you know, it's either really wide angle or maybe a long telephoto, something you don't have that will be fun to get out and shoot with. The other thing you could do is kind of really go to the extreme in terms of film cameras and get a pinhole camera. This is a Holga pinhole camera. And these don't actually have a lens, they just have a tiny pinhole that the image is taken through. And the images aren't super sharp, they have kind of an ethereal look. I've got some videos about pinhole photography. I'll put links for those too. But the, you know, new gear can be a way to recharge your creativity. And some of those things don't have to be really expensive. Like, you know, a pinhole camera generally going to be less than $100. I think this was like $69. And there's a lot of film cameras out there that can be had for very little money. This old Kodak Retina, which is a beautiful old German camera, I bought for $8 at a thrift store, and it works, and it's beautiful. So, you know, there are inexpensive ways too that you can add some additional piece of gear and use that to kind of recharge your creativity. But I approach that with some caution, because that can get out of hand real fast and you can end up with a ton of camera gear, which I think a lot of us do. So anyway, these are some ideas I have for jump-starting your creativity. I hope maybe some of these will work for you. If you have any ideas for ways that you use to jumpstart your creativity, please leave me a comment. I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, as always, thanks for watching.